Good evening and welcome to Roosevelt House of Hunter College. I'm Andrew Polsky, Professor of Political Science at Hunter and Acting Dean of the School of Arts and Sciences. It's my pleasure this evening to introduce our guest speaker, Scott Berg. Scott is a distinguished biographer, and Wilson is his latest in a series of extraordinary and penetrating studies, each of which is not simply a biography, but a window into a slice of American culture in the 20th century. His earlier works include Max Perkins, editor of Genius, which won the National Book Award and offers us insights into the world of literature in the United States in the early 20th century. It began as a senior thesis project at Princeton University. He couldn't put it down, so he continued and turned it into a major biography. For his biography of Charles Lindbergh, he was awarded the Pulitzer Prize. Here we get a glimpse into the creation of the culture of celebrity in the United States. And his study of film producer Samuel Goldwyn earned him a Guggenheim Fellowship. Scott has said that he spent decades thinking about Wilson before he began the formal research into this fascinating man's life. Wilson has been the subject of many biographies, which comes as no surprise. He remains to this day an enigmatic figure. He brought to the White House an unusual combination of attributes. As a distinguished scholar, a towering figure in the formative era of American political science, and a former university president, he ranks among the few men of great intellect to hold the office of president. He was convinced that he, and perhaps he alone, understood the public interest, that he could speak for the American people and give voice to their deepest aspirations, perhaps before they knew it. Yet his vision sometimes extended beyond his reach and led to crushing disappointments. He could not broker the lasting peace he sought when he brought the United States into the First World War. And his failure to deliver on the promise of self-determination alienated many anti-colonial leaders and helped to drive them to embrace more revolutionary doctrines. He was willing at times to make political bargains to advance his reform agenda, and he stands out among presidents for the scope of his first-term domestic reforms, a major series of accomplishments that included significant labor legislation, the federal income tax, and the establishment of the Federal Reserve Board. Yet his record is also marred by the expansion of segregation in federal employment and in the nation's capital. And he refused compromises that might have brought the United States into the League of Nations. Since Scott Berg joins us this evening in the former home of Franklin and Eleanor Roosevelt, I would like to touch upon the relationship between the two men. Franklin Roosevelt backed Woodrow Wilson when he sought the 1912 Democratic nomination for president, putting Roosevelt at odds with many New York Democrats. Partly as a reward, Wilson chose Franklin Roosevelt to be Assistant Secretary of the Navy in his new cabinet. The president did so despite a warning from Senator Elihu Root, formerly Theodore Roosevelt's Secretary of State, who said, quote, "Every person named Roosevelt wishes to run everything." Franklin and Eleanor would journey back from France with Wilson in February 1919, when the president returned to the United States amid the peace conference at Versailles at the very peak of his power. Roosevelt later claimed to have learned, as the conference was starting, that Republican leaders, including Senator Henry Cabot Lodge, had already decided to scuttle any peace accord. In 1920, Roosevelt would receive the Democrats' vice presidential nomination and Wilson's blessing. But the ticket went down to a crushing defeat. Roosevelt continued to promote Wilsonian internationalism vigorously over the next decade. And of course, at the end of the Second World War, he would bring to fruition the vision that Wilson had been unable to complete when the United Nations came into being. Scott Berg begins his book with an episode that captures Wilson at the peak of his power. On December 4th, 1918, he and his wife, Edith, board a ship in the Hudson River with the American delegation to the Great Peace Conference that's about to begin in Paris. It is less than 2 years after he has led the United States into the war that would make the world safe for democracy, what some call the war to end all wars. He must now fashion a new world order based on the principles he espouses: democracy, self-determination, and collective security. He arrives in Europe to an overwhelming popular reception, crowds larger than anyone has ever seen before in cities like Paris. A rock star before there are rock stars, carrying on his shoulders the hope of humanity that something decent can come out of the slaughter of the past 4 years. If these are impossible expectations, let us remember that Wilson himself chose to stir them. Who was this man on whom the fate of the world seemed to depend? Here is Scott Berg to tell us more about Woodrow Wilson.
Much. Thank you, and thank you all for being here tonight. I am going to talk largely about Woodrow Wilson. Before I get into Wilson, I am going to talk a little about my other favorite subject, and that would be me. And I thought I should just take a moment, though, to tell you how and why I should and would and did spend 13 years writing about Woodrow Wilson. What led to it, because in fact I've been consumed with Woodrow Wilson for about 50 years, in fact. So to start, and real briefly, I'll run you through grammar school quickly, but when I was 15, I did read a book about Woodrow Wilson, a slender book about him, and I just became fascinated. And ever since then, I have had a picture of Woodrow Wilson by my side wherever I have been for some strange reason. I'm sure I'm the only kid on the block who had a Woodrow Wilson poster up in high school, but yeah, win with Wilson. And there we were. Now to jump ahead, I did go to Princeton in large measure because my literary hero F. Scott Fitzgerald went there and my political hero Woodrow Wilson went there. Woodrow Wilson not only was an undergraduate at Princeton, he also taught at Princeton, he also became the president of Princeton. So there was a lot of Princeton history, a lot of Wilson history, so there was that. Now, while there, as you heard, I began my senior thesis on Max Perkins, the great book editor, and who discovered Fitzgerald, Hemingway, Woolf, a host of the greats in American lit between the two world wars. And after graduation, the reason actually I persisted, I think, in turning my senior thesis into a book was that I really didn't want to go to law school. And this seemed like the easiest way not to. Little did I know I was wrong, because it took 7 years to turn the thesis into a book. But thank you, Dean. Anyway, while I was writing that book, I began to think, wouldn't it be interesting to write not just this book, and only a 22-year-old is dumb enough to think like this, but I was thinking, wouldn't it be fascinating to write a shelf full of books about 20th century American cultural figures? And each one, I thought, would be from a different part of the country, and each one would be from a different slice of the apple pie that is 20th century American culture. So after Perkins, I did the Goldwyn book, Perkins being East Coast, Harvard-educated, New York publishing, Goldwyn, a Jewish semi-literate immigrant who went to the West Coast and founded something we now call Hollywood. Then came Charles Lindbergh from the Midwest, the great really the icon of aviation, romance of the skies, and our first modern celebrity. Parenthetically, I did a book on Katharine Hepburn, certainly iconic in her own right, largely because of a 20-year friendship. So I did a brief memoir, a biographical memoir of Hepburn. But then it was time to get back to my pie, Hepburn being sort of the a la mode. The pie, I hadn't done a Southern figure. I hadn't done somebody from politics and government, or higher education for that matter, which is a very important part of Woodrow Wilson's life. And while discussing it with my publisher, which book I might do next, I said, look, I've got a dozen possibilities here, but I have been carrying Woodrow Wilson's name in my pocket since I was 15 years old. Now, what do you think of that? And she said, I don't even want to discuss it. I love Woodrow Wilson, she said. And indeed, we got going. So here we are, all these years later. So that was some 13 plus years ago that we had that conversation, and now we have a book, and now I have Woodrow Wilson to talk about. I'm going to run tonight on a platform with two planks. I'm going to say two big things here, and I hope in the course of the next few minutes I can support those two things. If not, I've got a big book that will explain why I think these things. If I haven't fulfilled the contract, then too bad. But here we go. I believe Woodrow Wilson is the most influential figure of the 20th century. Okay. A lot of you are already, all right, I can do better than that. All right, go for it, go for it. Save it for the Q&A. The second is, I believe Woodrow Wilson's personal story is the most dramatic story ever to unfold in the White House. And it was this second thing that in fact interested me even more than the first in some ways, because since I was 15, I have been reading dozens, scores, hundreds of books on Woodrow Wilson. I never saw a single book that captured the image that had been developing in my mind, and most to the point, I hadn't seen a book that captured really the humanity of this person, that captured his personal life, that captured his emotional life, that captured his psyche. And I thought that is an extremely important thing to do. And I thought, one, the personal story would inform the other, the professional, that which made him, point one, the most influential figure of the 20th century. So, obviously we don't have hours and hours to discuss this, so I figured the way I could kind of break you into all this tonight, and I realize many of you already know a lot about Woodrow Wilson, and I hope what you do know, I might be able to alter some of those perspectives and perceptions as well. But I thought what I could give you would be a few bullet points, a few things to take home, walk out of this place, bearing these in mind. So here are a few superlatives. Woodrow Wilson was the most religious president we ever had, period. He was the son of a Presbyterian minister, the grandson of a Presbyterian minister. If you shake the family trees of the Woodrows and the Wilsons, going back to Scotland, I think another dozen Presbyterian ministers will fall from the branches. I mean, just littering the ground with Presbyterian ministers. Wilson really was a direct descendant of these people. He was not a direct descendant of John Knox, but he was certainly a direct descendant of his thinking and those Scots Presbyterians. It informs everything this man ever said, thought, or did. And it is not by coincidence, and we'll get to this a little later on, that when Woodrow Wilson delivers the most important speech of his life, what may be one of the most important speeches in American history, which I will also get to, the very last line of that speech conjures up, paraphrases Martin Luther. So this is a man who carries religion with him everywhere. Now, we've had a lot of religious presidents, usually once every 4 years they find their religion, and that's about it. Wilson was a man who got on his knees and prayed twice a day. He said grace before every meal. He read the Bible every night. He went to church every Sunday, period. And he inherited from his father, or rather developed it, who knows, a rather sermonic way of speaking. And when you go through his hundreds and hundreds of speeches, most of which he delivered off the cuff without a note. And they are perfection. I mean, they could be an hour and a half without a misplaced sentence. Most of them, though, have that tradition that he pulled from the pulpit, and you can almost see this young boy sitting in the various Presbyterian churches where his father served and delivering these sermons. Woodrow Wilson was the first Southern president elected since the Civil War. This is important for all sorts of reasons. The Civil War, of course, is the great divide in American history. We had not had a Southerner, you see, elected to the White House for a half a century. So when Wilson was elected president, there was a feeling in the nation for the first time that maybe these two halves were going to become whole again for the first time. Wilson was born in Virginia in 1856. He was raised in 4 southern states, Virginia, then Georgia, and the 2 Carolinas. It's extremely important in Wilson's upbringing, and it informed everything Wilson did for the rest of his life. He often said, "There is one part of the country nobody has to explain anything to me about, and that is the South." And this has a play in so many ways for the rest of his life. One, of course, has to do with the issue of race, which he will wrestle with for the rest of his life and never really vanquish. The second was, it really had a great effect on foreign affairs. Woodrow Wilson, you see, is the only president we've ever had who was raised in a country that had lost a war. He was born and raised in the Confederate States of America. Wilson knew what a war was like. He knew what losing a war was like. He saw it. He saw his father's church in Augusta, Georgia, be turned into a hospital. He saw neighbors from Georgia return maimed. He saw some neighbors who didn't return. When the family moved to Columbia, South Carolina, he saw a city still in ruins. It was charred still. He saw the devastation not just of the war, but then of Reconstruction. And Wilson soaked all this up. Most books about Wilson make almost nothing of all these things. I think it was extremely important because Wilson thought it was extremely important. He talked about these matters for the rest of his life, and you can see in 1914, when war breaks out in Europe, and people such as Theodore Roosevelt are urging this country to get into the battle right away, especially after the sinking of the Lusitania in 1915, you see Wilson doing everything he can to keep the nation out of war, because he knew what it meant. It wasn't just some bully idea. This was something that can decimate a country. Wilson remembered it. Woodrow Wilson was the most educated president we've ever had, period. I hesitate to say he was the most intellectual. One has to think of Thomas Jefferson at the very least, and I think if you go through the whole roster, a lot of us could make a good argument for a number of others who were not Jefferson's equal perhaps, but certainly Wilson's equal. But nobody was more educated than Woodrow Wilson. He went off to Princeton after a false start at Davidson College. He graduated in 1879 and already was entertaining at least the dream of a political career. He thought this would be a very exciting thing. His goal when he was in college was to become the senator from Virginia. Virginia was telling also because Virginia had given us more presidents than any other place. And he also realized that most people with political careers in America at this point had been lawyers. So Woodrow Wilson, canny young fellow that he was, enrolled at the University of Virginia Law School and tried to put it all together. He studied law. After he got out, he went down to Atlanta, Georgia, where he tried to establish a law practice. He went into practice with a friend. They opened up an office, and for about a year and a half, Woodrow Wilson practiced law. Or I should say he attempted to practice law. He proved to be a genuinely terrible lawyer, which is slightly unfair because actually he never really got to practice. He had no clients, zero, none. Year and a half, no clients. He spent his days just reading politics, history, political science, economics, writing essays, writing editorials, but no clients. Actually, he had one client, which he got through his mother. And the client was his mother, in fact. Yes, she had inherited some property, and she needed an attorney to draw up the papers, but it involved going to a town outside of Atlanta called Rome, Georgia. And Wilson, now wrapping up his legal career and really closing up his office, or his half of the office, went to Rome. Now, I mention this, it has no legal significance, and it has absolutely no professional significance in Woodrow Wilson's life. But while he was in Rome, Georgia, this Presbyterian minister's son met the local Presbyterian minister's daughter, and they fell immediately in love. Now, the fortunate thing for me, the biographer, is Woodrow Wilson had no career ahead of him. He had no job, and he was desperate to marry this very attractive young daughter of the minister. So that meant that they were going to have to put off the marriage he so desperately wanted for a couple of years while he found a new career, which was going to be academia. But it also meant that he was going to write letters back and forth, and she was going to write letters. And over the course of the next several years, these two young people wrote thousands of the most romantic love letters you will ever read. I am talking Woodrow Wilson here. And when I say thousands of letters, I mean thousands of them. They are deeply personal, they are emotional, they even dip into the sexual. They've got a little bit of everything. He really shares himself. He unburdens himself. He articulates in these letters. They're magnificent, but they go on forever. Biographers, be careful what you wish for. There were some of these letters were 15 and 20 pages long. I mean, how many ways can you say I love you, Which is all he did. And he would go on and on and on and on for 15 pages. And then later that day, he'd send her another letter. They were sickening. I could only read, there were days I would open up a folder and I'd say, not any more love letters to Ellen. Marry him already, marry him. They finally did. But these letters, here's why they are important too. And now, again, you see these two threads I talked about, the personal and the influential, the professional, the political. They are interwoven because I am thinking now as somebody who is going to tell his life, as somebody who wants to tell the life in a personal way. I believe, you see, these love letters, so passionate, aren't just about passion for a woman. I mean, anybody who can write all those letters is going to feel things very deeply. This is going to be a president who is going to take emotional responsibility for things that happen on his watch. This really, I think, bespeaks a caring man. And all this is going to play out, you see, in the rest of his career. Now, Wilson got on with his first career, which was academia. After he had this aborted law career, he went into academia. He went to Johns Hopkins University, where he studied a new field, something brand new called political science. Everything in those days was all about science. It was a great age of science. Home economics we suddenly had. We had political science. And indeed, Wilson became one of the first political scientists in this country, a genuine scholar. He's the only president we've had with a PhD. He got a job at Bryn Mawr College when they first opened their doors, and then he moved on to Wesleyan in Connecticut, and then he got the call he had hoped for if indeed he was going to have a career in academia, and that was at Princeton University, his alma mater. And so there is Wilson back at Princeton, where he takes the place by storm. He became almost overnight and for the next 12 years, an indispensable part, not just of the campus, but of the community. He was that one guy in that college town that everybody knew about. He was the mover and the shaker. He made it all happen, such that after 12 years, that is in 1902, the trustees of Princeton decided this man should be the president of the college. It came in the nick of time because the then president, a very decent fellow, but he was a guy who used to brag that he ran the finest country club in America. And he did. It is to this day perhaps the most beautiful campus in America, and it was then basically a playground for the sons of the very rich. And I mean the very, very rich. And this also becomes extremely important. Here is another element, you see, of the personal life that really dictates the professional life that Woodrow Wilson is going to have. Because while Wilson was a student, while he was a professor, even while he was president of Princeton, he was always had his finger in every pie. So he was part of things. But there was a great sense, a great feeling of exclusion on the Princeton campus. There were certain clubs when he was a teenager that he could not join. He saw that structure, that social system. He saw how that campus really belonged to the very rich. And Wilson resented that. He didn't resent wealth. He would later not resent big business, but he resented unfair advantage. That's what made him crazy, and that's what drove him. And I have seen, and you will see, running through his life, running through his career, this notion that the playing field should always be leveled. And if there was anything he could do, either on a college campus or in drawing the map of the world, as he would later do, it would be about leveling the playing field. Now, Wilson took on the education, the pedagogy at Princeton in ways nobody had ever seen on any campus. I will simply say that he reformed not just education at Princeton, but higher education in this country. If you went to a college or know somebody who went to a college in which you majored in something, in which there was a sequence of courses within your major, in which you took electives to complement the major, in which you took 2 lectures a week, and then had a small class perhaps run by a teaching assistant or a lesser professor, a junior professor, you have followed the Wilsonian model. Those are all elements Woodrow Wilson put together and said, this is Princeton education, and that became college education to this day in this country. Now, things were going pretty swimmingly until Wilson actively decided to take on the social structure at Princeton. And now he wants to really tear apart this exclusive club system. And it is at this point that the trustees at Princeton say, that's about enough, President Wilson. We sort of like the country club. I mean, sure, all these educational things are great. You know, that's really good. But we like the club system. So let's keep it. And they were just suggesting that he might be looking for a new career. And at that moment, the new career came to him. And the career came in the form of a political boss. Now, you're going to have to run with me. You're going to have to accept a certain premise to make the leap from academia that Woodrow Wilson did to politics. The premise is, back in 1910, go with me on this, New Jersey was the most corrupt state in the Union. Okay? I'm just saying, 1910. This was in part because it was run in large measure by the most corrupt political machine, the Democratic Party in New Jersey. They were so corrupt that they realized they needed a puppet, basically. They went looking for a face man. They went looking for the cleanest reputation in New Jersey. And they said, what about that professor over at Princeton, Woodrow Wilson, who's trying to level the playing field and get rid of these exclusive clubs? Sounds sort of progressive even. It sounds great. So they went to Wilson. They offered him the opportunity to run, that is to win the governorship. And he accepted. And he won in a landslide. And the first thing Woodrow Wilson did as governor of New Jersey in 1911, within weeks, is kick out the machine. I mean, literally barred them from entering state buildings. And now everybody in the country is looking toward New Jersey, especially the National Committee of the Democratic Party, who now sees a potential candidate for the 1912 election. Wilson made great strides in just 18 months as governor of New Jersey, introducing the most progressive agenda any state had seen and passed. But now begins, and here's another superlative for you, Woodrow Wilson enjoyed the most meteoric rise in American history, period. In October of 1910, he was the president of a small college in New Jersey. In November of 1912, he's elected president of the United States. I mean, this is just staggering. And how did he get there? Well, through brain power. I mean, he's not a famous general. He's not a famous legislator. He's a famous intellect. I mean, this is a guy who wrote books. He wrote speeches. I mean, this is somebody with a point of view about everything. And this became extremely attractive to the Democrats. They ran him in 1912, one of the most exciting elections in American history, in which Wilson ran against a Republican incumbent, William Howard Taft, who had so unsettled his predecessor, who had handpicked him, Theodore Roosevelt, that TR decided to bolt from the Republican Party and form a progressive party called the Bull Moose Party, and the three of them were running for president. Oh, and just to make this a little more colorful, let's throw Eugene Debs, the socialist, in, who did very well in the election, I should add. Won, 1 million votes in the election of 1912. But Wilson, largely because the Republicans are going to split the vote, coasted in the largest electoral college victory the country had seen to that date. So now we have Woodrow Wilson in the White House. And there, Woodrow Wilson introduced the most progressive agenda the country had ever seen. And he not only introduced it, he got it passed. And he did this by changing the role of the president, really, and the way the president operates, especially with Congress. You heard some of the list of the reforms that Wilson instituted in just his first few years in office. But the lowering of the tariff, the modern income tax, the Federal Reserve System, which has been the basis of the American economy for the last century, the 8-hour workday, the workman's compensation. He put the first Jew on the Supreme Court, Louis Brandeis, which was a really, not just a glass-shattering moment. This shattered so much in the country in so many ways. And Wilson just kept going on and on. It was just one reform after the other. And the way he did it was by the way he dealt with Congress. And are you listening? I should say, the way he did it was he dealt with Congress, which was really the case. Wilson had a notion that, just again, you got to ride with me on this one, but he had the belief, he being a political scientist, that the two branches of government, the executive branch and the legislative branch, that they should cooperate. And I mean that quite literally. He believed they should cooperate the government. And that meant Wilson wanted to humanize the presidency. He wanted to make the Congress and the country realize that the presidency wasn't just an institution, it was a person. It was a man, just like they were men who represented men and women back home, although women weren't necessarily represented in many states. So, Wilson showed up in the Congress. He brought back something that had not been done since 1800 with John Adams. He delivered the State of the Union address. Now, we now make a big public display of it once a year, and we're all one happy American family. But no president had done that since 1800. Wilson called joint sessions of Congress every other month just to introduce a new bill he wanted to do. Wilson showed up in Congress. He just appeared there, and he would go to work in a little room that is possibly the most beautiful room in the Capitol. If you stop 100 congressmen today, I'll bet 98 of them could not find this room. It is locked up. No president has used the room before Wilson or after Wilson. I think part of the reason is it has a somewhat complicated name. It's called the President's Room. And it is intended for the president to show up and do work with the legislators whenever he wanted. Nobody's used it except Wilson. How about that? Well, Wilson got this incredible domestic agenda passed. That's what dictated most of his first term, except for two great cataclysms. The first, his beloved wife, Ellen, the one who got thousands of love letters, died in the White House after 1 year living there. Wilson was despondent, deeply depressed, talked about his greatest wish just then was that somebody would shoot him and kill him. Not suicide, mind you, he was too religious for that, but that somebody would kill him. The only thing that got him out of bed was the second cataclysm. The very week Mrs. Wilson died, the World War broke out in Europe. So now they're knocking on the door saying, Mr. President, there's a war going on. You've really got to come up with something here. Who are we in this war? And now let's go back to Wilson, the personal story of the Civil War. He did everything he could to keep us out of war. And indeed, that became his campaign slogan in 1916. He kept us out of war. Shortly after he won that election in 1916, one of the great squeakers in American history also, running against Charles Evans Hughes. But in March of 1917, he was reinaugurated, and in April, Wilson realized this nation had to go to war. Or more to the point, Wilson believed this nation had to go to war. And on April 2nd, 1917, Woodrow Wilson delivered a speech that is, I've already suggested, the most important speech he ever delivered. I think it's the most important foreign policy speech that has ever been delivered in this country. And there is one sentence embedded within that speech that has become the foundation of American foreign policy for the last century. And that sentence is, the world must be made safe for democracy. Now, whether you like that theory or not, whether you agree with it or not, doesn't matter. It is with us a century later. Whether it was Wilson bringing American troops into Mexico or Haiti, whether it's Vietnam, whether it's Iraq, Afghanistan, whether it's President Obama talking 2 months ago about Syria. And are we the policemen of the world, he said, or he suggested, can the United States just sit there and do nothing when it sees a dictator killing his own people, gassing children? Does the country, Obama was suggesting, not have some moral responsibility? With greatness, does there not come responsibility? And these elements began with Woodrow Wilson in that speech in 1917. It's as simple or as complicated as that. Wilson led us into the war. He proved to be a superior commander-in-chief. We won the war, needless to say, It was the greatest mobilization this country had ever seen. We went from having a standing army the size of that of Portugal's to having 2 million men and sent them over an ocean. And ultimately, I believe the reason Wilson committed American troops to that war was he believed if we fought it and won it, then the United States, that is Woodrow Wilson, could dictate the peace. And that's what he wanted to do, because he had a plan with 14 points that he thought would make the war they had just fought the war to end all wars. The 14th point was the creation of a League of Nations. Was it a great pipe dream? Was it just an idealistic vision? Was it something quixotic? Or was it a very practical thing? In Wilson's mind, it couldn't have been more practical, that there would be a table at which every civilized nation would sit. They would agree to certain terms in order to get a chair at that table. If you violated those terms, you invoked the wrath not just of a country, but of all countries. So therefore, war would be over. Well, there it was. Wilson came back from Paris. 6 months he was gone. President of the United States. I mean, we get upset when the president plays golf for 6 days, you know. 6 months he was gone. Came back with the peace in hand, with his League of Nations intact, but he returned to an extremely hostile and an increasingly Republican United States Senate, whom, as you heard, had already decided even before he got back, they were against anything he was for. Can you imagine a Republican Senate? Have you ever heard? You know. But he did. And when he realized they were not going to pass his beloved treaty, Wilson, I think, embarked on the greatest campaign for a cause that any president has ever embarked upon. He went to the people, a 29-city tour around the country, in which he spoke sometimes 4 or 5 times a day. On behalf of the League, he was genuinely winning hearts and minds. He was winning the battle. When he collapsed, they rushed him back to Washington. 3 days later, he suffered a stroke. And now the story gets good. Because what then began is what I believe is the greatest conspiracy ever to envelop the White House. And it is this. Mrs. Wilson, the second Mrs. Wilson, oh, did I tell you? He fell in love again. President Woodrow Wilson went courting. He met, almost cute, out of a movie, he met an attractive young widow living in Washington, fell instantly and madly in love with her, courted her with hundreds of the most passionate love letters you have ever read. I mean, these made the other letters, I mean, those were puppy love. This is grown-up love now, you see, because he's now in his 50s. This is his last stab at romance. He's got to win this woman, and he does. He marries her within a year. And now, Mrs. Wilson, who is not educated, who certainly has no political acumen, or even interest, I should add, but Mrs. Wilson and a handful of doctors made a private decision that they would tell nobody that the President of the United States has suffered a stroke. Now, Wilson could still speak and he could think, but he was incredibly weak. He had great emotional swings, great mood swings, and frankly, his judgment was off. I mean, you know, a lot of things happen when you have a stroke, which we now realize. There are feelings of euphoria one day. There's deep depression another day. I mean, he was all over the map. And Mrs. Wilson, for all intents and purposes, for the next year and a half, was running the executive branch of the United States government. Nobody saw the president without going through Mrs. Wilson. No document, no appointment, nothing that required a signature. No issue was presented to the President of the United States without Mrs. Wilson deciding which 2 or 3 items of the thousands that come up every day were going to be presented to Woodrow Wilson. Well, it's a remarkable story. Some have said, and you can argue it, she was the first female president of the United States. You will see, because I go through this almost day by day, what she did and what she didn't do. She was no Lady Macbeth, but you will see she really was running a branch of the government on a day-to-day basis. In any case, Wilson became the lamest duck in White House history. He left the White House in 1921. He's the only president who retired to Washington, D.C. There he and his wife moved into a rather elegant but simple house up above Embassy Row. And there Wilson faded physically, emotionally, and mentally. And he died in 1924. But something interesting happened in those last 3 years. And it was this: Warren G. Harding. And what that meant was, almost immediately, he revealed his immorality along with his corruption, which was a wonderful thing, largely because people began to yearn for Woodrow Wilson. They really began to long to go back to that kind of purity, the morality, everything he brought to the picture there. And on Armistice Day, November 11th, 1921, the first anniversary that the Wilsons were now out of the White House, 1,000 people gathered outside the house just to get a glimpse of Woodrow Wilson. Every afternoon, the Wilsons would take a drive around the city. There'd be 10, 20, 50 people just waiting on the lawn every day across the street, just hoping to see him. The second year out, 10,000 people gathered. The next year, 20,000 people. Wilson, you see, had become this incredible icon of peace and freedom. And, well, that's really something that he took with him. And it's why a legend persisted about Wilson for decades to come. We are not put in this world to sit still and know, said Woodrow Wilson. We are put in it to act. Well, I hope each of you will take a little time to sit still, or a lot of time, and get to know Woodrow Wilson. And I hope then you will act. And part of that action, I think, is to kind of spread the word that, again, whether you like this man or dislike him, whether you believe in what he did or don't believe in it, you've got to accept the fact that you should know Woodrow Wilson. You should feel Woodrow Wilson, because we live in a world of his making. Thank you very much. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you, thank you. Oh, as you were. Thank you. Now, I've already kept you long and late, but I would be very happy to take a few questions. And do I call on the? Then I will call on you, sir.
Thank you. The narrative that you gave us was very much the one that I grew up with, which was over 50 years ago, when Woodrow Wilson was considered, in a poll of American historians, the fourth greatest
Correct.
president. That was done by Arthur Schlesinger's father. Over the years, his reputation declined significantly.
Yes.
In significant measure, I think, because of his views on race. Can you comment on that?
Yes. Thank you for asking. It is one of the great ironies that the most progressive president we had had to date was also, when it came to racial matters, the most regressive we ever had. Again, I can give you the argument, this is a man who grew up in the South and so forth, and there was all that. He remembered the segregated South, and here's what I think was going on in Woodrow Wilson's mind and in his life and what he did as president. And make no mistake about it, I now express Woodrow Wilson's views, not mine, okay? That being said, Wilson entered office in 1913, became president. He had an extremely racist cabinet. which he appointed. The cabinet was by and large Southerners. There were two or three also rather progressive men, and I'm thinking especially of his Secretary of the Treasury, William McAdoo, who later married his daughter, who was a proud racist. I mean, racism was something you didn't have to hide in 1913. This was something you could wear. There were senators who were proud Klansmen. Again, they didn't hide their sheets. I mean, they would have worn them to work if they could. There were Klansmen on the Supreme Court. This was just kind of the way life was, especially in Washington, D.C., which was a small southern town. We're also still within 50 years of the Civil War. There's still a lot of people refighting the Civil War and realizing, okay, we're never going to have slavery back, but we can at least separate the races, can't we? I mean, the Supreme Court did say in 1896, separate but equal is the law of the land. So there we go. So that's the world Woodrow Wilson walks into as president with all his own Southern baggage. That being said, I believe integration was on his mind, but that was about it. And he felt, and I think very deeply, that the country simply wasn't ready to integrate. There had been some toeholds in integration in the Treasury Department and in the Post Office. And it was the Postmaster General and the Secretary of Treasury who came up immediately to Wilson and said, we want to introduce segregation, Jim Crow, into the federal offices. And Wilson did nothing. He allowed that to happen. So the buck stops there. He must take complete responsibility for it. He felt, as he often said, that there was just too much friction and that was going to create a conflagration. And I think part of him didn't want it on his watch. I think part of him truly felt that he was protecting the black man as much as he was protecting the white man. He did continue to make some appointments of African Americans to some middle-level jobs and to some judgeships. So he was aware of that. He always kept his door open to African American petitioners. I've heard people say, oh, he never allowed a black man in the White House. Well, he did. I mean, regularly. He saw groups of African American petitioners, and he listened to them. And I think actually the greatest of them is the writer James Weldon Johnson, who met with Wilson a couple of times. And after his last meeting with Wilson, he left and he said, he wrote actually, I've got to get over my prejudice of Woodrow Wilson. Not that Wilson was any great shakes, and he said, I don't trust Wilson, but I've got to stop my prejudice because at least the talk Wilson was talking was correct. So that was a start. But at the end of the day, at the end of his 2 terms, he basically did nothing to advance the African American, and probably not even arguably, he set them back, although he would not agree to that. He believed, and this he also said, because he knew the South, he always said, even if I were ready for this, the rest of the South is not. And he often said, it will take another generation or 2 before the United States is ready to completely integrate. And if you get out your calendars, he got it almost to the month. So, back row, yes.
I'm a Wilsonian, but it's hard to argue that Wilson's influence on history is greater than FDR's, unless perhaps there wouldn't have been the FDR who we know, but for the influence of Wilson.
Next question. Well, I agree with that. I mean, to the extent that, yes, of course, and I use that partially as a conceit, but FDR would be the first to tell you that everything he built upon, from his very progressive New Deal to his foreign policy, his internationalism, was pure Wilsonianism. And FDR was in Paris. He was part of the entourage there. He did get his first national break as the Undersecretary of the Navy. He watched Wilson. This is easy for me to say as the biographer now looking back, but I just see all the time it appears to me anyway, maybe I just want it to appear this way, that FDR was really clocking him, seeing what he did, what were the moves he made. And now I'm really going to go out there and you'll think, oh, shut up already, right? But Wilson and Cox of Ohio, who were the 1920 Democratic ticket, come to visit Wilson in the White House to get his blessing during the election. And Wilson is now crippled. He's in a wheelchair. He's got a blanket over his legs. He's got his arm, his dead arm buried and all that. And he sort of tilts his head. He sort of looks straight ahead, shows no weakness, whatever. When he goes out for a drive, they plunk a hat on his head and they put him in the car. And it's just me, I understand, but I'm telling you, I'm sure FDR paid attention to some of this stuff. I'm sure he remembered those images because, you know, it was just a few years later that FDR was stricken. And suddenly this giant of a man was in the wheelchair with the blanket, with the hat being plopped on his head. So yes, to that extent, yes, indeed, was Franklin Roosevelt, well, he had a bigger world to change. But I dare say all of that, all the building blocks came from Woodrow Wilson. So to the extent that he, quote, invented FDR or contributed to it, I'll stick to Wilson. Sir.
Yeah, you touched on and I think rather quickly moved into Wilson's decision to try to bring the America into World War I. Given the ambiguity of the opponents in World War I and the horrors that were already evident on the battlefields there and all that followed, what were the factors that tipped Wilson into finally deciding to enter the war? What was he hoping to accomplish given all that had taken place before?
Well, in the ideal, I mean, let's start with the idealistic and move down to the realistic, to the practical. I think it goes back to the leveling of the playing field again. I mean, he was deeply disturbed from the beginning by Belgium being just walked over. And if you look at the 14 points and whenever he talked about the League, he either cited Belgium specifically or he talked about, though, how the small countries, how the little nations should have the same right to exist that the big ones do. So that kind of bullying made him crazy. So that was a persistently growing thing. The second thing, I think, was watching this war unfold. He, again, said more than once that there were perhaps no two armies in history who were so perfectly matched. And indeed, the two sides would often fight battles for 6 or 7 months, and they wouldn't gain 4 inches either way, but 100,000, 1 million men, would just be decimated. Now, indeed, moving down a notch, the economy of the world was going to hell. America was, of course, rising in importance because we did not have to invest manpower or money power as much as they did. So that was something, and now he's starting to think, okay, do we not have this greater responsibility, this moral aspect that we have to think about? Now, while that is going on also, and this is ultimately what was beginning to tip the scales, the Germans really not only kept up, but they stepped up this policy of torpedoing ships, and they were announcing that they were going after neutral ships, and there were great debates in this country. In fact, Senator T.P. Gore of Oklahoma was recommending that the president order all Americans to stay off of ships that were going across the ocean to foreign lands. It was, it boiled down to that. Just stay out of it. And Wilson's feeling was, we can't do that. Why do we have to shut down because they're having their war? But American lives were being lost, most famously on the Lusitania, but there were a dozen other ships going down after that. And that led to Wilson embarked upon several years of diplomacy that he hoped would end the war. I mean, there were memoranda flying back and forth all the time between Washington and Germany, and of course including France and Britain and all the other countries. And Germany would just basically play this game. They would stall for a while, then they'd say, yes, of course, we're now disciplining the people who torpedo those ships, and we will stop doing it. And then 2 months later, there'd be another incident, and then the memoranda would keep going back and forth. They couldn't even keep up with all the memoranda. And so that was happening. And then, of course, by the time we get into 1917, we learn of the Zimmermann telegram, in which Germany is trying to collude with Mexico, saying basically, why don't you come into this little war with us, and maybe you'll get Texas and California back, And so now it is really reaching this point where it was inevitable. Wilson, I think, felt a certain inevitability from the beginning. He was a great Anglophile, but he preached neutrality, I think, as strongly as any man could. And in fact, he encouraged his countrymen to remain neutral in thought, even, which got ridiculed by a lot of people, the likes of Theodore Roosevelt. But Wilson, if he didn't believe it, he at least espoused it again and again. So I think it was a gradual accretion of things that were happening, such that by April, Wilson felt he had also prepared the country by then. We were getting militarily prepared, economically prepared, and emotionally prepared, psychologically prepared for this war, which he did using his greatest weapon, his oratory, which he really kept stepping up quite gradually, hoping at any given moment that it would all end somehow. And when it didn't, when it wasn't, ultimately he felt this great urge to get into it. Sir, yep.
I wonder if you could help us understand why this president, I wish you could help us understand why this president, who was a political scientist, who had worked with the Congress, who understood politics, was so apparently inept in his greatest task, which was to get the peace treaty and the League accepted by the Senate.
The big reason is, in the end, he didn't practice what he preached, as often happens to not just presidents, but all of us. But it had reached a point when he came back from Paris. Here's what I think went on. At the very end, and don't forget, he was gone 6 months. So by month 5 and 6, he's starting to make compromises. He's got to get home. And Clemenceau knew this too. So Clemenceau was stalling every day or retreating, and Lloyd George the same thing. So toward the end, Wilson was making some rather untoward compromises, in fact. And I think Wilson, at that moment when it was finally done and he still had his League, it was, okay, I've done all the compromising I am going to do in my life. That's it, because I've got this League. And for the rest of his life, he came back and he said, I cannot yield a single sentence when it comes to this treaty because, and this is going to go back to the Civil War, follow this personal thread again with me. It's going to go back to his saying, and it's for me the most moving scene in this book. But in May of 1919, Memorial Day, he is still over in Paris. And he goes to the American Cemetery in Suresnes, where he speaks before hundreds and hundreds of American graves. And he can barely get through this speech. And he talks about how he sent those boys over there and how he was personally responsible for the deaths of every soldier there. And he vowed that no mother would ever have to bury her soldier son again. And he came home with his League of Nations, with his treaty, and by God, he was not going to give an inch on that. And I think he became so unyielding that that's part of the reason. Now, I'll throw in one more element, and that is, and this I was able really to parse, because in the course of my research, a cache of papers was came to the surface. It's hard to believe 100 years later we're finding Woodrow Wilson papers. But his doctor left a lot of papers, some of which had been public, but some of which had not, some of which detail what was going on in Woodrow Wilson's head. And indeed, he had this famous stroke on his tour, but he had been having strokes for decades. As far back as his 30s, when he was at Princeton, he was having little minor episodes. And there are, as again you'll see in the book, there are two moments in Paris where he's almost loony. I mean, clearly something is going on inside his brain. I mean, there's one day where literally he starts rearranging the furniture. It's manic. You know, he says, I have to move the purple chairs away from the green chairs, and I want all the French to sit on blue chairs. And his doctor says, Mr. President, why don't we take a little walk around Paris, you know? And then it's all over. And then he comes back and starts rearranging countries. But this stuff was going on. So I think also a lot of his reluctance, a lot of his stubbornness was a result of what was going on in his brain as well. I mean, you know, even when you have a cold, you're impatient. You do things quickly. Because you want to get back to bed. And I think this was going on in Wilson's head big time, really big time. Yes, ma'am.
Could you talk a bit about the Treaty of Versailles and Wilson's view to it? And many people believe it laid the foundation for World War II.
Yes, the question was about the Treaty of Versailles itself, and did it in fact lead to World War II? I think that's an easy statement to make, and I don't really believe it. I think there were greater things at work there. I will say this about the Treaty of Versailles. Woodrow Wilson went over, left the country for 6 months. He encountered 24 other nations who had all arrived to basically lay out the peace and to draw a new map of the world. Because don't forget, 4 gigantic empires had toppled. I mean, we had the Romanovs, the Habsburgs, the Hohenzollerns, and the Ottoman empires. I mean, that's half the world is now up for grabs. It's a jump ball. And there it is. Now, Wilson comes over. He finds 24 negotiators, each of whom has a very special agenda for his country. Wilson came over with no national agenda. He had only one thing he wanted, a League of Nations. He had an international, a supranational agenda. That's what he wanted. And so he's now up against all these people who finally he'd get some to concede something. And then the next day they'd say, you know what, we don't want it. We want it back. So by the end, now months 5 and 6, they start horse trading. And there are 2 or 3 things in that treaty that even Wilson knew were bad, particularly where it came to China and how they were dealt with and power that the Japanese would have in that part of the world. That was troubling. There's been much talk over the decades of the reparations bill that was handed to Germany, that it was too onerous. In fact, it was not. The German economy could deal with it. And in fact, they never paid it. They only paid 20 cents on the dollar in the end. And they really had no intention of paying it, I believe. So I don't think that was an issue so much either. The other thing, that Wilson, again, followed the personal thread back to the Civil War and Reconstruction. Wilson always said, repeatedly, he would say to the French especially, if you punish the Germans too hard, they will simply come back at you with greater vengeance. And he said again, and this is in writing, that if you do come back too hard, all these countries will fight the same war in 25 years. Again, pull out your calendars. This time you can check off Monday. I mean, he really got it on this one. And so, were there certain seeds that led to the war? Sure. But I will say this. I think whatever was in that treaty, Adolf Hitler was going to rise. He was not pleased with what was happening. He was not, they had lost a war. It was it's humiliating when you lose a war. Woodrow Wilson knew that. He grew up in a country that had lost a war. And I think there were more personal seeds and there were more global issues. The entire world economy was also up for grabs. And I think there were so many countries that were so vulnerable to these new alternatives that were being pressed upon the world, whether it was communism or whether it was Nazism. So I think they would have taken rise, whatever that treaty had to say. I would only say about Wilson that he tempered it, I think, as much as any human being could have. And had he not shown up, it would have been a devastating treaty. I mean, that, I think they would have virtually just, wiped Germany off the map in many ways. That's my feeling about it. Sir.
Can you think of any decisions that were made during the period when Wilson... any decisions that were made during the final part of Wilson's tenure as president when he was really under the care of doctors and his wife, when decisions were made or legislation was passed that really jeopardized the country moving forward?
Well, there were virtually no important decisions made once Wilson was in bed, except, let me give you one big one, which is the notorious Palmer raids. And we have not talked about the fact that he was also, I said he was the most repressive, he was also the most suppressive president we ever had during World War I. He reintroduced alien and sedition laws that had really not, well, Lincoln played with them, but they really go back to John Adams. And they were horrendous. Now, that being said, Wilson is now in bed. He has a very aggressive Attorney General, Mitchell Palmer, and he is interested in running for president in 1920 and is looking for a good issue. And he launched these raids. And basically, all this happened on Wilson's watch, but he knew nothing about them. They were kept from Wilson. So there's an example of his incapacity basically allowing bad government to be taking place. But there was no legislation passed per se that was of great significance. It was all that he wasn't able to do. Most specifically, he couldn't fight the last of the fight for the League of Nations. And with that, we have one more question, I'm told, and it goes to you, sir. First, yep.
What do you make of the irony that the modern inheritors of the Wilsonian mantle are neoconservatives like Donald Rumsfeld and William Crystal?
Well,
or at least they claim to be the inheritors
thank
of
you.
the Wilson doctrine.
Yeah, they do. Well, it's, here's the thing. I think Wilsonianism, Wilson, his name, has been used and abused as much as anything. I mean, it's a very nice shield to hide behind, to say, oh, this is Wilsonian. I'm fighting for democracy around the world. Well, that was part of what Wilson was suggesting. But I'll tell you, when I saw President Obama during the Syria crisis, and a lot of people, especially, well, a lot of people, I'd say more from the right, were attacking him for hesitating so much, for not doing enough, for not getting in there and mixing it up. I kept thinking, God, that's very Wilsonian what he's doing. He's hesitating. He's waiting. He's see, maybe diplomacy will work. Who knows? I mean, maybe Russia and Syria will come up with something. Crazy. But Wilson kept hoping something like that would happen with World War I. So, part of Wilsonianism was not to rush into war. Again, that war, World War I broke out in 1914. We did not declare war until April of 17. We didn't have men over there until 1918, and they weren't actively fighting until the spring of 1918. So we were only in for 6 months. That's rather good practice, I think, rather good commander-in-chief. keeping the fighting of his soldiers to a minimum. That is not, I think, what the Rumsfelds have in mind. I mean, it's sort of nuke first and ask later. Wilson was just the opposite. War was always the last measure you would even consider. So again, I think it's a great abuse of the term. And with that, I think I will send you on your way. Thank you. Thank you.
Moment that Scott will be upstairs signing copies of the books which are available. Thank you and good evening.